I love eating chicken. It's just such an easy way to get your protein, family friendly. You can do really interesting things with it.
We're farming well over a billion birds in the UK alone each year.
It's so obvious when you think about it. How can you buy a whole chicken, literally an animal that is raised, fed, grown with people who are specialists looking after it for the same amount of money as a cup of coffee?
That's created the conditions where chicken is omnipresent, seemingly very cheap, but with lots and lots of hidden costs.
Welcome to the In Good Taste podcast with me, Malika Basu, food writer, commentator, and advisor. Every week, we bring you short, sharp episodes on what's shaping our food and drink today. Today, we're covering chicken. I don't know about you, but I love eating chicken. It's just such an easy way to get your protein, family friendly. You can buy a whole bird, do really interesting things with it. But all chicken isn't built and reared the same. So what should we as food lovers be looking out for? I have the most amazing guest today. His name is Rob Percival. He wrote a great book called The Meat Paradox, but also he is head of policy at the Soil Association, which certifies organic produce in the UK. So he really knows his stuff about welfare, what is good, what is not so good. So let's see what he has to tell us about the subject. Great. So hello, Rob.
Hello, thanks so much for inviting me to be here.
Thank you so much for making the time. Now, you're obviously the man in the know when it comes to meat.
I have more than a passing interest in the meat question, yes. I've been immersed in the muddy and complicated world of meat for many years now, so really pleased to be here.
Well, the book is actually fantastic. And I know you have put stuff about chicken in there. So I'm just going to kick off to say we are eating so much chicken now, aren't we? I think the number is something like it's quadrupled since 1961. And it is the most eaten meat in the UK. So why is that?
We're farming well over a billion birds in the UK alone each year. And there's been this extraordinary transformation across the last 6 or 7 decades. If you look back to traditional farming systems, pigs and chickens, their role really was to mop up wastes and byproducts and bits that humans couldn't eat. You know, they're omnivores, so you can feed them all the offcuts and the crops that didn't make it and so on. And they were sort of integrated in a sort of rational manner into the sort of mixed farming systems, which were very traditional. But in the last 6, 7 decades, we've had this transformation into an industrial mode of production, where we're now locking tens of thousands of birds in a single shed, and it's a completely different logic. And for lots of different reasons, as you say, the market has taken off and chickens are now the world's most popular meat. And it's been an extraordinary transformation.
It's interesting why, isn't it? Why we eat so much chicken. I mean, just thinking about myself as a home cook, it's often a healthy meat. You know, it's quite lean protein, feels quite clean. It feels like an easy choice to make. So you can get a whole bird in the way that you can't necessarily buy a whole cow to feed her. Well, I could. I just wouldn't know where to put all of it in my home. But how much of that is perception versus reality?
I think you're right. There's this perception that chicken is a clean meat. It's very versatile for those who are cooking. You can do lots of things with it, which means it's had international and sort of global appeal. We've become increasingly suspicious of red meat as a society over the last couple of decades. There are these sort of associations and connotations with climate change or cancer. It's also just a bit more obviously bloody and from an animal, which, you know, chickens we kind of look at slightly different to mammals perhaps. But behind the scenes, there's also been this terrific consolidation of the industry. The genetics of these birds are owned by just a couple of companies. All the production and processing is overseen by a handful of corporations that most of us are blind to. And that's created the conditions where chicken is omnipresent, seemingly very cheap, but with lots and lots of hidden costs. So there's a dark side to it as well. It's a great meat to work with if you're a foodie or a chef, but the production side is really, really problematic.
Okay, well, let's start unpicking some of that, because you've covered 2 things I think we must talk about. One is climate change, yes, and I think there's lots of research out there that shows that people are switching from eating beef to eating more chicken, which is obviously one something. But fundamentally, something has happened to the bird itself, hasn't it, in terms of what we eat and how that's changed from many years ago. So what is it? What is the reality of what the bird itself that we're eating looks like now compared to what it was like 50 years ago, these so-called Franken chickens?
So the main transformation has been in the rate of growth. So the poultry companies, the genetic companies, in pursuit of sort of efficient production, have really manufactured these mutants who grow excessively quick, more quick than their body can really handle, in order to reach slaughter weight at an earlier date. So we're getting them to grow to a fat eatable size as quickly as possible. And we know that it takes a terrible toll on the bird's metabolism. The sort of skeletal problems are common. They struggle to walk, many of these birds. They are confined in these very, very intensive systems for the most part. And we kill them as they're adolescents, essentially. They don't get to reach any sort of full maturity. That's also affected the nutritional quality of the meat, the sort of balance of fats and proteins and so on. And I'm talking in generalities here, but the vast majority of birds in the UK, around 95%, fall into this category. And this is true globally as well. This handful of fast-growing breeds really dominate chicken production around the world. So the key sort of priority from a welfare point of view is to think about birds growing more slowly and giving them more space and a better life. But there are some environmental challenges that come with that. It's if we do that, we're going to have to eat fewer birds. So it's a complex trade-off and a real big transition that's needed, I think, if we're to go back to something that actually resembles a healthy bird living a good life.
Let's come back to that in a bit, because there is a bit of a move towards, better animal welfare for chickens. Is what you're talking about, the 95% of chicken that we eat, is that broiler chickens?
Yeah, so we farm broilers. They're the ones that we farm for meat, and then there's a big, obviously, industry for egg layers as well, laying hens. And there are similar but different challenges in that space. Again, the conditions in which most of the birds are reared are far from ideal. And again, they've been sort of genetically manipulated for productivity in ways that are detrimental to their welfare.
It's so obvious when you think about it. How can you buy a whole chicken, literally an animal that is raised, fed, grown with people who are specialists looking after it, for the same amount of money as a cup of coffee?
It's extraordinary.
It is quite extraordinary. I mean, the answers, if you start thinking about these things, the answers are quite obvious, aren't they? That it just, something is not quite working in terms of the cost, and who's bearing the cost, who's bearing the real cost. So let's start with this animal welfare piece. And by the way, I have to be really honest to anyone listening or watching, is that I love eating chicken. Sorry, yes, I'm an omnivore, and I'm very interested in sort of unpicking some of this. I used to also be on the board of an egg company, so some of the stuff I have seen up close, but obviously they are very, very high up there on welfare. But tell me about things like, if you're going into a supermarket and you're buying some chicken, what does typical welfare look like?
So I think, first of all, you don't have to feel sorry or bad for eating chicken. The challenges I'm describing are not the result of everyday people making bad choices. There's this real consolidation of power in the industry and governments that have consistently failed to live up to public expectations. So there's a real imbalance in responsibility here that sits largely behind the scenes with these faceless corporations. But the reality is that most chickens, as I said, the broilers, the meat chickens, are raised in intensive systems, in sheds of 30 to 40,000 birds at a time, or maybe more. The stocking density as a standard is around 17 to 19 birds per square metre.
Wow.
It's very, very intense, and there's a stage in the growing process which is called thinning, where the birds have started to grow a bit. They're already lacking in space, but now they're getting really, really squashed. So some men come through in the middle of the night and pluck out a bunch of them to just before they're fully grown, to give a little bit more space in those last few days of their life. The lighting in these sheds and then the atmosphere is carefully controlled. There's usually very little enrichment, so they don't have much to peck at or enjoy, and it's not a very nice thing to talk about. But the sad truth is that a lot of them are sitting there in considerable discomfort, sitting in their own waste often, which can cause skin problems and all sorts of harms to their legs and feathers. And the good news is there's an alternative. We don't have to be
There is good news.
Yes, I'm sorry, I've taken you down a dark rabbit hole there, but you did ask the question. It could be so different. It could be so much better for the birds and for us.
And so beak trimming is part of it, isn't it? There's quite a lot talked about beak trimming. Can you tell us what happens there? Because I think chickens are quite cantankerous creatures, aren't they? They don't really like going outdoors. They don't really enjoy being manhandled. So what is beak trimming all about?
So beak trimming is what it sounds like, where you nip off the beak to prevent feather pecking or cannibalism, which can be a challenge when in those really stressful environments. The good news and the bad news is that it's not really that normal in the UK. It's generally not performed found on conventionally reared broiler chickens. But that's because they're slaughtered before they reach sexual maturity, when the aggressive pecking typically begins. So I guess every cloud has a silver lining, you could say.
Gosh.
But these are beautiful birds. They're descended from these wild jungle fowl that roamed the jungles of Southeast Asia. These majestic, intelligent, sensitive creatures they're actually far brighter than we give them credit for. They recognise faces. They have complex social systems. They care for their young. And there's every reason we should be thinking of them as brilliant animals that deserve a good life. And there are ways that they can be, on farms and enjoying something that's much closer to that. So there's good ways and there's bad ways to do this. But unfortunately, most of the chicken on a supermarket shelf is not done the good way.
Right. And this nicely brings me on to the piece about free range and organic. So when I was growing up in India, you'd call them broiler chickens and country chickens. And country chickens were effectively free range, predominantly organic. They were running around, they were a bit skinnier and dinkier. And then you had the broiler, the fattened up chicken. And so when we're going in and buying, like, say, a free range chicken or an organic chicken, what exactly does that mean?
So free range is a sort of stepping stone on the way to better welfare. It's better than the average intensive stuff. And the intensive stuff, which generally speaking we should probably be avoiding, comes with this red tractor logo. That's the industry standard, but it's not a symbol that means higher welfare. Free range is better. They have a bit more space to roam around. They can get outside if they want to. The sheds must have natural light. They do grow slower. There's different breeds often used, which is great. And then organic is the step beyond. That's where the birds have even more space. They have consistent access to the outdoors. It's much smaller flocks. The flock sizes are capped. Organic is still, there are ways that you could go beyond organic. It's not necessarily like the best possible life for a chicken, but it's the best sort of commercially available system. And if you're in a supermarket or somewhere, then the organic stamp is the thing to look for.
That's very interesting. And of course, you work with the Soil Association. You're head of policy there, and you guys certify organic, don't you? That's your day job, if you like, when you're not writing books.
Yes, that's right.
Excellent. Before we move on to actual eating of chicken, baby chicks, what can you tell us about that? Because baby male chicks, I've heard some quite disconcerting things about. What happens to them?
So in the meat chicken industry, broilers, they grow up and we eat them, same as any other birds. But in the egg industry, where you need female birds to lay eggs, they're culled at a young age, and there's around 40 to 45 million male chicks that are culled each year in the UK. They're usually, if we want to get into details, they're usually gassed. Though the horror stories you might have heard around maceration, where they're sort of killed by high-speed machinery, that is legally permitted, but not the norm in the UK. And the meat is not for human consumption, but often used as a source of food for zoo animals or pets. So the meat does go somewhere that redeems the situation. But there are moves to phase this out, to innovative ways perhaps of being able to sex the chicken before they're born, so that it's only the females who are born. But it's a big ethical quandary, yes, and it's sort of all tied up to this very linear, intensive mode of production. It's not like it was, as I say, back in the day, a traditional farm system where you'd have chickens roaming around the place, sort of integrated into a broader pattern of production. This is hyper efficient. And that's why we make these choices.
Let's talk a little bit about chicken eating, because, of course, the great thing about eating a chicken is that you can eat a whole chicken. You can actually enjoy it in quite a lot of ways. But what I found in the West particularly is that we have a thing for chicken breasts, which I don't really understand, because to me, it tastes a bit like polystyrene meets rubber, and it's pretty impenetrable to spices. So what's going on? Well, why is this chicken breast a thing?
Yeah, for some reason, here in the UK, we have much greater appetite for the white meat than the dark meat on a chicken. So we're into the breast, but we don't like eating legs and wings so much. We don't really eat the offal very often. We don't eat the feet as we could be doing. So there's a significant trade. We import, as well as producing massive amounts of white meat, and we export the legs and the wings and the offal and the feet. Imports come mainly from Europe, from Poland and similar, but also significantly from Thailand and Brazil. We import a lot of white meat from there, and then we export across the EU, the legs and so on. So the sensible thing to do, and this applies to any meat type, not just to chicken, is for us to become much less picky, eat the whole bird, eat the whole carcass. Nose to tail eating is more efficient, and you could make the argument that it's more respectful. If we're going to take an animal's life, then let's not just pluck off a couple of bits that we particularly like. We should be eating everything that we can and getting used to the fact that we're dealing with a dead animal here. So the offal and so on, the edible bits that we're a bit squeamish about, should be on the menu, I think.
Very much so. And I know you're hot on this. So I tell my kids when they waste chicken, it's like an animal literally gave up its life for you guys. Like, eat the meat, like eat everything that's in your plate. And seems like an obvious thing to do. And with chicken, it's a lot easier. We haven't talked about some of the environmental factors, of course, because industrial production of chicken also has things like runoff, doesn't it? And pollution. So there's a little trade-off with chicken running around. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about that before we go into the nitty-gritty of what we can see on packs?
The biggest environmental impacts from chicken production are associated, first of all, with its feed. So we import millions of tons of soya into the UK, largely from the Americas. And that soya is produced using harmful agrochemicals, toxic pesticides. It's often grown on land that's been converted from wild habitat. And a significant impact comes from that soya production. And then what you're doing when you're importing millions of tons of soya is importing millions of tons of nutrients that are contained within that soya, nitrogen and phosphates. And when the birds eat the feed, their litter, their manures, if you like, contain all those nutrients. So we then have millions of tons of poo to deal with, and it's usually used as a fertilizer. Farmers will spread it on their land. It's useful, but all these excess nutrients then wash off when it rains into a nearby river or watercourse, where they cause real ecological harm, eutrophication, and these events that sort of choke and clog up the rivers. And we're now seeing, particularly in the River Wye and various other watercourses around the UK, the effects of chicken production resulting in a sort of dead river, if you like, or a river that's on the verge of dying.
So now we're seeing these claims on packs, slower welfare chicken. There is a move, isn't there? There's the European chicken commitment and the better chicken commitment in the UK. That's the UK version. So what are these exactly? And what do those labels particularly mean for food lovers like me?
There is a move across the industry, these commitments that we've seen to adopt what is called the better chicken commitment, which is a set of small but meaningful welfare improvements, including a shift to slower growing bird. There are some retailers in the UK that have realised this ambition. Waitrose and Marks and Spencer's are now fulfilling their commitment. But a lot of industry bodies and businesses have recently dropped out. Have said they're not going to do this anymore. It's the likes of KFC and Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, Burger King, Nando's, Bella Italia, all these guys who said they were going to do this, and now they've come up with their alternative industry standard themselves, which isn't as strong. And so it's still a bit of a struggle to get the industry onto the right footing with regards to welfare. And the argument they're making, which is quite a perverse argument, is that these birds, if they're slower growing, they have a higher environmental impact. So there's a trade-off that needs to be navigated, and that's their reason for failing to deliver welfare improvements.
But it's true, isn't it? Because when a chicken is allowed to roam freely and it lives longer, it eats more feed, they do have more of an impact on the environment. Is that right?
If you live a bit longer, then you eat more feed, yes. And therefore, if you're looking at a impact on a sort of per bird, arguably there is a higher environmental impact. But that's just to achieve a really basic level of almost good enough animal welfare, which has to be a non-negotiable. So the only way to square the books is balance the books, is to farm fewer birds. You can then produce them to a better standard of welfare without an increased overall environmental impact. And our diets will have to adapt somewhat. We'll be eating more beans and pulses and plant proteins. Chicken can still be part of the mix, but if we're to have a system that's genuinely ethical and sustainable, there are some of these knotty issues to navigate along the way.
They're so knotty, Rob, especially if you think about who it will affect, because we're talking about profits here, right? Like profits will take a hit for big corporations if they have to spend more money, have to do things slower, better. And obviously, I can't imagine anyone's overjoyed about that, which might explain what's happening, why people are pulling back. But also, the need for cheap food hasn't gone away. And if you think about the sort of people who need to access affordable food, putting the cost of chicken up isn't necessarily useful for them, but you have no option. You're up against a terrible system, aren't you, effectively?
Yeah, and I think you've used two similar but quite different phrases there: cheap food and affordable food. So affordability, I think, is a relative concept. That something's affordable depending on what other pressures you have on your life. When it comes to access to food and the really significant challenge of food poverty and food inequalities, we need actually to be talking about housing costs, rental costs, social welfare, looking across the whole of society to think, how do we create the conditions for people to be able to afford to eat well? And actually just pursuing ever cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper food as the answer is the wrong answer, because we know this only externalizes the costs. It fuels the climate crisis, which creates all this instability. It ruins the countryside. It creates all these perverse outcomes for our health and for the planet. We can't keep pursuing ever cheaper food as the answer to this equation. We need to look more holistically across society at how we create the conditions for everyone to eat well. And that's a really challenging equation to balance.
Really challenging.
But it starts with that bigger view and with a joined up approach to food across government and across society, not just getting industry to produce an ever cheaper product.
So, assuming that, we are food lovers, we're motivated by pleasure and joy and everyday sustenance, getting the best we can. Two things. One is we're going to a restaurant and we look at a menu. What can we actually do? What can we order or look out for to do better for chicken, make better choices?
I'm with you. I think there's a real joy in food, and I think that comes from its sensory pleasures, from the community that comes around it, and it can be hard balancing that with these ethical concerns. I think in a retail setting or so on, in a supermarket, you can look for free range or organic being the ideal. If you're shopping in farm shops and sort of smaller scale outlets, you can ask questions and come to understand how things are produced. Restaurants are maybe a bit more challenging because it's often quite opaque. The sourcing information might not be there, in which case I'd say go for those beans and pulses and enjoy the delicious flavours of minimally processed plant proteins and so on. But it's, there's no harm in asking the question in that context. Every couple of years, we at the Soil Association send out secret diner families to restaurants around the country to sample the children's menu. And we get them to ask all these questions, where's the meat come from? What's the production system? Is there welfare assurance? And we get some very, very interesting answers. And it can be quite empowering, we're told, by the secret diners. They might not choose to buy that meal, but just asking the question reminds you that you do have some agency here, and you can put them on the spot and probe what's going on behind the scenes.
Well, absolutely. And agency is a great word, isn't it? It's the kind of power you have as an individual to make change or to ask the right questions. Some chefs, of course, put provenance on the menu. I love that. I love hearing about a breed of pig or, a type of chicken. And I know there are brands that are actually focusing on that, telling the stories about, better breeds of chickens and slower reared and all of that. So that's something nice to look out for, I suppose. The other thing is spent hens. So I do know about Leghorn, which is a company that's putting hens that are kind of past their laying age, if that makes sense. And I have experimented with cooking it at home, and it's richly flavored. It's almost got sort of gamey quality about it. Have you come across that at all in restaurants?
I have seen this around the place, and I think you mentioned these different claims and things. I think slower growing is the key one to look out for. If you see that, and if they're being authentic, then that's the good things to look out for. Spent hens, it really, to some degree, my feelings about this depend on what production system they've come from. If you're taking a hen from a commercial egg-laying system who's lived a 15 to 18 month life of toil in a very small caged environment and now is of no use to the industry because they're not laying as many eggs, then it's kind of ethical and good that we're eating them instead of just slaughtering them and wasting them. But the spent hen concept in itself doesn't necessarily mean that they've had a good life. I think the key thing here is that we do need to get used to eating different types of chicken meat, different flavours, different flavour profiles. The dual breed birds could have a role in a future ethical farming system. We're mixing up egg production and meat production, and they're roaming around the place, so they are a bit more muscly, and it's a different type of meat. And learning to cook with those flavours and enjoy them is a really, really good thing. That's better than us being hooked on the white meat from types of industrial systems. But we do need to be careful with the spent end concept, that it doesn't necessarily mean the birds had a good life.
Interesting. See, there's the trade off again. It's never black and white, is it?
Never black and white, no.
Let's go back and finish up with nose to tail eating. So, as I said, I love buying a whole chicken, and I will literally now mostly buy a whole organic chicken and then divvy it up. If I have to buy pieces, and it's not always affordable to buy, individual little pieces of organic chicken, then I might do free range from a good, vetted supermarket or supplier, butcher. But with the whole chicken, there's quite a lot you can do, isn't it? I mean, chicken feet is one of the key ingredients in a good ramen broth, for instance. So what do you do with your whole chicken? Let's brainstorm some ideas and see what your foodie credentials are now, Rob.
So I should probably have brought this up earlier. This is the point where I confess I don't eat chickens.
Ah,
But
no!
if I was, then I would definitely be eating your chicken foot broth. I mean, that sounds amazing. And this is what we need. We need creative cookery using all parts of the bird and unashamedly celebrating the use of the feet or of the offal, whatever it might be, putting that not sort of in the background as a guilty secret in a dish, but saying, no, look, we're making good use of this. There's types of flavour in these parts of the birds that are slightly different to what you might be used to every day, but there's a lot of richness here. There's a very versatile use that you could make of this carcass.
Well, it's a really great book. Rob, thank you so much for coming along. Lots for us to chew on. And I suppose, could I just summarize what we've talked about by saying if we can afford it, we should spend more on better chicken and use as much of the whole bird as we possibly can. Is that about right?
That's about right. And eat your beans and pulses alongside as well.
Excellent, excellent. Music to my ears. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, tell all your friends about this, and see you here for the next episode. Bye now.